I want to thank everybody for coming. It's, you can please continue to get food. It's very meaningful for me to be back here at Sons of Israel, the synagogue that I grew up in. I want to thank Rabbi Pilavin and the congregation for having us. And I want to thank Rabbi Pilavin also for help setting up earlier. Thank you to Rabbi Jacoby. Together we run the Manalapan Jewish Connection. We provide inspirational programming to the Manalapan Jewish community. If you want to have any ideas or if you want to partner with us in any events or anything, please let us know. If you're interested in studying Torah 101 or in a group, or perhaps starting a Torah class or joining a Torah class, there's a sign-up sheet outside. Or if you want to come up to one of us. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Schlinger family for sponsoring tonight's event. And I also want to thank another donor who wants to remain anonymous, who was very close with Larry Bloom, as tonight's program is dedicated in memory of Larry. Rabbi Shor, who was the rabbi here when I was growing up, used to say that if we forget we're Jewish, there's going to be a force to remind us. And Larry was someone who did not need to be reminded that he was a Jew. He was a member of the synagogue since he was a child. Rabbi Pilavin mentioned at the funeral his commitment to minyan and how he was a stalwart of the synagogue and to the services in the synagogue, and not only here but also at the Union Hill congregation. And actually, several years ago, I met Rabbi Gedalia Dov Schwartz, who was a rabbi here in the late 1950s, and he mentioned how he was Larry's bar mitzvah teacher when he was a child in the old building in Englishtown. So Larry really was part of the brick and mortar of this building. As a child, I have fond memories of being with Larry at Shal Shudas, singing songs after listening to Rabbi Shor's his Parsha class. And I just remembered as a child, he exuded warmth, and even as a kid, he would talk to you like you were on his level, which I think is something very special, and it made you feel really good as a kid that an adult took the time to speak with you and didn't talk down to you. That's something I always remembered. His lifelong friend, Alan Brooker, mentioned at the funeral what a warm person he was and how nice he was, and everyone who met him said the same thing, and what a good friend he was. And that's something I kept hearing about Larry. After he passed away, I heard multiple stories about how he would give money to people and nobody knew about it, to different people who needed it or different institutions, and he did it quietly without any fanfare. He was a unique person whose memory he's greatly missed, and may this event be an aliyah for his neshama. So we're all aware of the horrific events that have been happening regarding anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. After Pittsburgh, even, a Jewish Columbia professor, she came to her office to find swastikas painted outside the door. Recently, I don't know if anyone heard about this, but in our backyard in Lakewood, there was a doll dressed up as an Orthodox Jewish girl with a knife through her head stuck to a tree. In Britain, Prime Minister Theresa May recently spoke and had to beg Jews to stay in the country because apparently Jews in Britain don't feel safe and they want to leave. And we all know about the commonplace attacks on Jews in France and other parts of Europe. And according to the ADL, from 2016 to 2017, anti-Semitic incidents have risen by 57%. So therefore, we're privileged to have Rabbi Becher back in Manalapan to speak about some of my best friends are, ... anti-Semitism causes and effects. Rabbi Mordechai Becher, originally from Australia, is senior lecturer of the Gateways Organization and an instructor at Yeshiva University. He received his ordination from the Chief Rabbinate of Israel and the Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem, and he holds a master's in medieval Jewish history from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University. He taught at Or Sameach and Neve Yerushalayim in Jerusalem for 15 years, and also served in the chaplaincy of the Israel Defense Forces. Rabbi Becher has answered thousands of questions on AskTheRabbi.org, and he presents a Talmud class, Dimensions of the Daf, on cable TV with the Jewish Broadcasting Service. Rabbi Becher's latest book, Gateway to Judaism, which is on sale outside, published by Art Scroll, is in its 9th printing. He's taught in the US, Canada, England, Israel, South Africa, Australia, and Russia. And he's conducted tours in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and Israel. He's a massive Talmud Chacham and a great scholar, and it's our honor to call on Rabbi Becher.
Thank you for that introduction. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak now. Any Jews in the audience? Raise your hand. No? Any anti-Semites? Raise your hand. No. Okay, it's not a contradiction necessarily, by the way. You know, I've been to Jewish functions where I left as an anti-Semite. But okay, and we are having the traditional Chinese food. I actually scholar in residence for a tour group called Legacy Kosher Tours. We do tours in the summer, and it's a religious group. It's a religious group, so they sometimes want to visit places of Jewish holy places. They asked me, in China, are there any graves that we can go and pray at, Jewish holy sites? I said, the only grave that I know of in China where Jews pray is the grave of General Tso's chicken. But in general, we don't. There's no other graves that I know of. Now, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we do run a risk, and the risk is what Gavin Longmire calls the Lacrimosa view of Jewish history. The Lacrimosa view of Jewish history is a view of Jewish history as going from pogrom to expulsion to decree to Inquisition to expel. It's really depressing, and it's not accurate. It's not accurate. There were many, many good times in Jewish history. We had, as Rav Shlomo Carlebach used to say, how many bar mitzvahs and bas mitzvahs and weddings and sheva brachas and siyum masechtas and stuff like that. That never makes the news. The only stuff that makes the news is usually the bad events. In the book of Joshua, biblical book of Yehoshua, it's fascinating. There's lots of wars, and there's a lot of verses spent describing the various battles and the struggles and the wars. And there's one verse in the middle there. It says that the land was quiet for 40 years. Now, the truth is that 40 years is longer than entire chapters of the book of Yehoshua. It's just that, 40 years, nothing happens, so there's nothing to report. So I just want to first of all point out, so we don't get all depressed about our Jewish history and say, well, forget this, I'm going to the church next door. No, rather, I wanted to point out that I'm focusing on anti-Semitism here. That is correct, but it is wrong to consider a Lacrimosa view, that is the tearful view of Jewish history. There are tour guides who do this. There are different types of tour guides. Some are the Oy vey tours, where pretty much there's oy vey and oy vey. And there are some tours which are the oh wow tours, and they ignore all the oy veys. The history is somewhere in between oy vey and oh wow. But we are focusing tonight on oy vey, I'm sorry. But that's the subject, and the fact that you are here means that clearly you are Litvish. Litvats enjoy a good cry generally, so that's what we're going to hit. Okay. So first of all, a brief survey, which is not so easy. To survey anti-Semitism even in an hour is just not possible. I'm reminded George Bernard Shaw was in the United States once, and he was asked to give a brief survey of English literature. And he said, how long do I have? They said, 15 minutes. He said, how can I tell you everything I know about English literature in 15 minutes? And they said, speak slowly, George. So we will speak slowly. First of all, one aspect of anti-Semitism, and it's hard, again, defining anti-Semitism is not so easy. For example, we just celebrated Hanukkah, the recent celebration of Hanukkah, in which the Hellenists in the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria, the Seleucids attacked Israel. I don't know if I would define the Seleucids or the Ptolemaic Empire as anti-Semites. They were anti-Jewish. Anti-Judaism would be more correct. They didn't care about Jews living. If Jews lived, but they lived as Greeks, they'd be fine with that. There are some, for example the Nazis, who it doesn't matter what your ideology was, it would not matter what your religion is, it would not matter how Jewish you acted or behaved, it would be irrelevant. You could quote Goethe and sing Wagner, etc., and they'd still want to kill you. That's anti-Semitism. Okay, is that clear? It's not. Now, usually for the person being attacked, it's the fine difference is not really that relevant. But again, so there was anti-Judaism. Rome, the Roman Empire. Was it anti-Semitic? Well, it's hard to say. The Roman Empire extends over a long period of history and many, many countries. But the Roman Empire, when they were invited into Israel and they took over the country, etc., I don't know if I'd describe them as anti-Semites. They were against Jewish nationalism because they wanted Pax Romana, Roman peace. They wanted an empire that you were paying taxes and you were not revolting, as Pescennius Niger, a Roman governor of Palestine, said to Jews who complained about the excessive taxes. Pescennius Niger said, you complain about the taxes? Would that I could tax the very air that you breathe. Right? That's common. We call that the carbon tax now. In any case, so unclear, is that anti-Semitism, is it not anti-Semitism? That's type of unclear, but it's, again, not that relevant. But there were anti-Semites at the time. You had Appian, who was a Greek historian, who wrote anti-Semitic tracts about the Jews. Josephus Flavius wrote a book called Contra Appian, refuting Appian's claims. But amongst his claims were that the Jews were thrown out of Egypt. Not the Jews didn't escape Egypt. They were not taken out of Egypt. Jews were thrown out of Egypt because they were dirty, they were diseased, they worshipped the head of an ass, they practiced all types of horrific sexual depravity, etc. So, yeah, that's probably anti-Semitism. I think that qualifies. So Appian had this type of legends. There was also a legend going around already at the time in the ancient Greek Empire of, and Appian writes about this, that the claim that the Jews would fatten up one Gentile a year, and sacrifice him in the temple. Of course, later on in history, that blossomed is not really the right word, but that mutated is a better word, mutated into the blood libel idea, which we'll talk about. So it started back with pagans. It continued into Christianity when the Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Empire under Constantine. And Christianity, of course, has its own form of anti-Semitism, as you probably know. There is a custom, I was talking with the Rabbi here before, that there's a custom a lot of people have, which is not to learn Torah, not to study Torah on the night of Christmas Eve. Why would you not study Torah? There's all types of ex post facto explanations. The explanation probably is that most people in medieval times didn't have books in their home. Books were very expensive. They were not printed, they were handwritten. Most people didn't have books. So if you wanted to study Torah, what would you have to do? You would have to leave your house and go to the synagogue. Leaving your house for a Jew in the medieval ghetto or town on Christmas Eve night was not safe. So you did not go to the synagogue to study Torah, which means people didn't study. So it became a custom not to study on that night. I was told there's a charity in Israel called Kupat Ha'ir. You ever heard of them? They'll have rabbis pray for you and stuff like that. For $180, they'll have a group of rabbis play chess at the Western Wall for you all night Christmas. But in any case, there is this idea, and that was because of Christian anti-Semitism, and there was a lot of that. That continued all the way till the 20th century. It continued, and again, to describe all of that would be very difficult, but to give you some examples, we have the 1144, the mid-late 12th century in England. There was one of the first recorded blood libels in which William of Norwich was a fairly well-to-do town. The Jews in Norwich were doing pretty well financially, but there was a Christian child disappeared, and Jews were accused of ritual murder. There was an accusation that basically the Jewish community around the world would decide on one community once a year would take a Christian child, the epitome of innocence, and do a reenactment, so to speak, of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, how the Jewish communities around the world got together pre-internet in the 12th century is unclear. No one really ever explained that. They would select this child and torture him and crucify him, etc. And that was one of the earliest blood libels. And of course, Jews suffered from these accusations throughout history. They went all the way through medieval times. And again, the libel changed over times. Eventually, they came to believe that Jews needed Christian blood. It wasn't just a reenactment of the crucifixion. There was a need for Christian blood. So, for example, all types of theories arose in medieval Europe. Why did Jews need Christian blood? I don't know if you know some of the theories. One of the theories was that there was a Jewish stench. There's a specific stench that the Jews had, and they could cure that only through using Christian blood. There was another theory that it was for Jewish men to cure Jewish men. This is believed by clergymen and peasants. A lot of people believe this in medieval Europe, that, for example, Jewish men menstruated, and the only cure for that was Christian blood. There was a belief, then eventually a belief developed that Jews needed the Christian blood for matzah. That was not as common to believe that. Then there was also another libel called torturing the host. It's like, that's torturing the host doesn't mean staying too long at Shabbat lunch. We are indeed guilty of that, yes. Right. Torturing the host meant that in Catholic, as you know, in Catholic churches, there is something called the Eucharist, the doctrine of transubstantiation, which means, nothing to do with the subway, what that means is that the wafer is believed to transform into the body of Jesus, and the wine transforms into his blood, and part of the communion is taking and eating the wafer and drinking the wine. This is still done in Catholic churches today, as I'm sure you're aware. Jews were often accused of stealing or somehow getting hold of the wafer, which is known as the host, and the Jews would take this, stab it, boil it in oil and burn it in a way so they would be torturing the baby Jesus by torturing this wafer. Witnesses would step forward and would testify that they heard baby Jesus crying as the Jews stabbed the wafer. They would say that they saw the wafer bleeding, etc., etc. And Jewish community, Jewish communities were massacred because we were accused of torturing a cookie. This is unbelievable. It sounds bizarre, but people believe this. Gavin Langmeyer, in one of his books, actually has a theory that one of the reasons that the doctrine was so irrational and difficult to believe that this legend, this libel, was created as a means of reinforcing their belief. Because you see, even the Jews, who are enemies of Christ, believe that the wafer becomes his body, because otherwise, why else would they torture it? Right? It's this perverse logic that even it's unbelievable. So there was torturing of the host. Then you had further libels that developed in Christian Europe, especially around the time of the Black Plague, that the Jews were responsible for poisoning wells and were responsible for trying to wipe out the population, etc. And sometimes they even combined. So the Jews would steal Christian blood and use the blood to poison the wells, and so on and so forth. So it was like a twofer, etc. These actually were the prompted pogroms, etc. Of course, as you probably know, in Christian Spain, the Jews suffered terribly. 1391, riots broke out in Spain against the Jews, and that's when a lot of Jews, many were killed, but many converted to Christianity, at least openly, and secretly kept some level of Judaism. How much they kept is unclear. One of the great scholars of the Inquisition period was Ben Sion Netanyahu, the father of the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. His father was a professor at Cornell University, one of the great scholars of the Inquisition. He wrote a book about the Inquisition in one of the greatest moments of Bibi Netanyahu's career. Absolutely fantastic. The first time he met the Pope, he gave him as a present his father's book about the Inquisition. It's like Israeli diplomacy at its best. It was just like... There you go. Right. So, but it's unclear how much they kept. But eventually, the Inquisition, which was focused primarily inwards in Christianity, meaning they were looking for insincere Christians. They didn't care about a Jew who openly professed Judaism. But the insincere Christians, like Jews who claimed to be Christians but were not, that's who they were against, culminating in expulsion in 1492. Now, what's interesting here is that even after the expulsion, so there were many thousands of Jewish conversos, Jews who converted to Christianity but were still secretly Jewish, living in, not all of them were secretly Jewish, a lot of them just became Christians. They were living in Spain. And what's interesting is that now that there were no legal limitations on what these people could do because they were Christians, so now they were competing financially and politically with Christians. So they had to come up, in Spain, they came up with a new way of discriminating against these people called limpieza de sangria, which means purity of blood. They would say, yes, true, these people convert to Christianity, but they're not pure blood. And so then, even after these Jews have been living as Christians for 100 years, 200 years, there's still discrimination because they're not pure bloods. Right? It's unbelievable. So, and this, of course, as we know, continued. So now, but it was not only limited to Christians. In Islam, although under Islam it was usually much better for Jews than under Christianity. Bernard Lewis says very often, compared to Christian Europe, living under the Muslims was paradise, but it was not paradise. Just that was relative, and there were many aspects of anti-Semitism involved. First of all, but this was not only directed against the Jews, it was directed against Jews and Christians, al-Kitab, the people of the book, in which those who were monotheists who lived under Muslims had to pay a special tribute, jizya, to the Muslim rulers, and there were certain rules that they had to keep, the dhimma, or the protected minority. Now usually, it wasn't so bad, but there are streams within Quran and Hadith that do, I think, encourage possibly some anti-Semitic opinions. There is a belief called tahrif. Tahrif is the belief, and this is actually in the Quran itself, that's the belief that the Jews corrupted the Bible. The Bible that we have, according to traditional Islamic belief, has been corrupted by the Jews. We removed all references to Muhammad from the Bible. You guys are familiar with that? Last meeting of the Elders of Zion, we discussed that. And so we removed all references to Muhammad in the Bible. We put in superstition and witchcraft. We took out all the good stuff. And basically, tahrif means a complete perversion of the truth. So this is what the standard Islamic belief about Jews involves, the belief that we have perverted, corrupted the Word of God. So that certainly is the type of thing that can encourage anti-Semitism, I've got to say. And amongst traditional Muslims, of course, there's a huge range of Muslims around the world, and many of them, probably most of them, are not anti-Semites. Most of them probably haven't even heard of Jews. Only 15% of Muslims are Arabs. Most of them, the largest Muslim country in the world, which just experienced this horrific tsunami, is Indonesia. Okay. So probably most of Indonesians never heard of Jews. But in any case, there is a strong feeling of, and of course nowadays we know that one of the main sources of anti-Semitism in the world does come from extremist Muslims, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Fatah, Hizbullah, Al-Tariq, Hezbollah. I could keep naming terrorist organisations all night, and also from many Muslims certainly in Europe, and that's a serious worry for security, fear for a lot of Jews. They cannot walk around. There are certain areas of Paris and many areas in Europe where you should not wear a yarmulke. You walk around with a yarmulke, you're endangering your life. And so there is that anti-Semitism. And it's not just anti-Zionism. I don't know if anyone has read the writings of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was a Islamic theologian who lived in the mid-20th century. He's very famous for his hatred of America. He wrote a book about America, and if anyone's heard of him, Sayyid Qutb. No, okay, not popular here in Manalapan. Okay, understandable. So Sayyid Qutb wrote a book, Our War Against the Jews. Our War Against the Jews, not our war against the Zionists. It's our war against the Jews. And the language, and in his book, certainly in Arabic, virtually every conspiracy theory about the Jews is there. Protocols of the Elders of Zion, blood libels, you name it, it's there. So that's not classic. That's not just nationalism, anti-Zionism. That's real genuine anti-Semitism. As of course you know, today anti-Semitism also comes and has come from the far right. As in the case of the fascists, of the Nazis and Italy, etc. But it also comes, nowadays a lot of it comes from the far left. From the extreme left is one of the great sources of anti-Semitism. And don't fool yourselves, BDS, the boycott, divest and sanction movement against the state of Israel is really an anti-Semitic movement. Because as Alan, what's his name, the lawyer, the most famous lawyer in the world, right, Alan Dershowitz, right, as pointed out, there is no BDS movement against China for its occupation of Tibet, for its torture and summary execution of people, for its suppression of Christianity, etc., for the suppression of Tibetan Buddhism, nothing. There's no BDS movement against Yemen. One of the greatest humanitarian disasters in the world is happening in Yemen today, and it's Muslim against Muslim. No one seems to care that much. In fact, when on days when thousands of Muslims have been killed in Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc., not a word is said, but if one Palestinian is shot by an Israeli soldier at the border, then that is a worldwide outcry. You only have to look at the record of United Nations votes and condemnations. Literally, there was one day, I think it was 2 weeks ago, there were 16 condemnations against Israel. On that same day, hundreds of Yemenites were murdered, hundreds of Syrians were murdered, hundreds of Libyans were murdered, hundreds of Sudanese were murdered, and there was not a word about that. Not a word. So it is interesting. I think it's hard not to see that as anti-Semitism. So again, we've got it from the far right, we've got it from the far left, we have from Christians, we have from Muslims, and even today, there are those there are many Christians who are very pro-Israel. I attended a conference known as the Kufi Conference, Christians United for Israel. We were at the national, some conference centre in Washington, I forgot what it's called, and there were probably about 6,000 Christians in this room. I was there with my mechutin, Rabbi Lerner, who is involved in this group. He's Jewish, obviously, but he's rabbi. But he schlepped me along, and it was unbelievable. We're sitting in this room. Pastor Hagee's church choir is on stage singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. People in the audience are crying, everyone except the rabbis, right? They're singing Hatikva. There are students dancing the horror. Christian students dancing the horror. One of the lecturers was from Bar Ilan University, who was a Kohen. At the end of his lecture, he said, I want to all give you the blessing. I'm a descendant of Aaron, the high priest. I want to give you the traditional blessing of Aaron, Yivarechecha, Hashem Yishmerecha. And he's giving them the blessing. People sitting there crying. It's like, it was unbelievable. I've never seen that in shul. I have seen it towards the end of the sermon, but generally it's like tears of tears of anguish rather. Anyway, but it was unbelievable. But there are those, the Southern Baptist Conference, who recently voted to divest from Israel. There are numerous. Why? So it's interesting. So we have a longevity, a universality to anti-Semitism, as I pointed out. Woody Allen once pointed this out. He said his parents sent him to interfaith camp every summer. He says there he was beaten equally by people of all races and creeds. So there is a universality to it, number one. Number two, there's an intensity about anti-Semitism. An intensity, meaning there have been attempts to absolutely annihilate us completely, as in the Khmelnytsky pogroms, which were only held back by the lack of technology of the time. But the attempt was to torture, massacre as many Jews as possible, the Nazis, etc. There's a longevity about it, meaning it's all the way back through Egypt, Greece, Rome, Dark Middle Ages, Renaissance, modern times. And there's an irrationality about it also. The hatred is like, it's weird. You know what I mean? The accusations, we've been accused, as I said, torturing the cookie, a wafer. We've been accused of killing God. Deicide. Which is itself a little strange, especially since if you would ask most Christian kids in Sunday school, why did Jesus die? The answer would be, no, to atone for your sins. Had he not died on the cross, we'd all be condemned to eternal damnation in hell. So why is deicide bad? I'm not sure, but it is, right? And so we're accused of that. We're accused of the blood libel, which is in general a bizarre type of... And by the way, many popes during medieval times declared that the blood libel was false. There were statements, official investigations by the Holy See, the Vatican. There were statements by pope after pope that there's no truth to the blood libel, and still it persisted. It persisted. So there's a certain irrationality to it, the poisoning of the wells, these Jewish maladies, the exaggerated influence of the Jews. It's unbelievable. And it permeates everywhere. Now, again, not every statement about Jews, which is a criticism, is anti-Semitism automatically. I just gave a class in Philadelphia to a group of lawyers. It was a CLE class, continuing legal education. We were talking about there was a comedian doing improv for lawyers. And then I spoke about, does God have a sense of humour? And so I was researching this, I saw the Europe's Journal of Psychology has an analysis of the joke. Here's the joke. I don't want to analyse it too much because a joke is like a frog. If you dissect it, it dies. So I don't want to do that. But basically there's a priest walks into a barber and he says, I'd like a haircut, please. So it usually happens at the barber. And the barber says, certainly, Father, sit down. And he says, after the haircut, he says, how much will that be? The barber says, you are a man of God. There is no charge for you. He said, God bless you. Thank you so much. And he walks out. The next day, the barber comes to the store. Waiting for him at the door is an envelope with 10 crisp $1 bills. And it says, God bless you, Father Mulcahy. He says, what a decent fellow. Unbelievable. The next week, an imam comes to the barber. And the imam gets a haircut. And he says, how much is that? And the barber says, no, for men of God, I do not charge. And he says, Bismillah Allah, right? And he says, in the name of Allah, God bless you. And he says, thank you so much. Anyway, the next day he comes to the barber shop, and waiting for him at the door, 10 crisp $1 bills in an envelope, right? Imam Ahmed Mulawi, right? God bless you, Allah bless you. He says, wow, decent guy. That's very nice. A week or two later, a rabbi comes in and says, like a haircut. And he says, how much? And the guy says, Rabbi, for you there's no charge. Men of the clergy, I do not charge. And the rabbi says, thank you so much. The next morning he comes to the barber shop, waiting for him at the door, 10 rabbis. Now, laughing at that doesn't make you an anti-Semite, I don't think, right? I mean, otherwise we're all, right? It is a type of injury. Jews obviously tell jokes like that. But again, there is anti-Semitism around, and Rabbi mentioned a few examples of that. So it's strange. I think and there are many explanations that have been given. Some are true in certain limited situations, but very few are universal. For example, the scapegoat concept. Yeah, but it's strange that you have to blame someone for the ills of society, but that wouldn't explain why there's anti-Semitism even when things are going well. And it wouldn't explain why it's always the same scapegoat. You know what I mean? Like, there's plenty of goats out there. Blame a different scapegoat. Right? In addition, some say it's economics. You ever heard the economics one? Jews were involved in money lending. But you see, that's putting the cart before the horse. One of the reasons Jews were involved in money lending was because we were not allowed to be involved in anything else. We were excluded from the trade guilds. We were not allowed to own slaves. We were not allowed to own land. We were not allowed to treat non-Jewish patients. We were not allowed, etc., etc. So we were forced into... And by the way, you have anti-Semitic stereotypes. William of Norwich and other things. They were before there was any evidence of any economic stereotype of the Jews. So therefore, again, that doesn't really work. Aside from which... there was anti-Semitism in countries where Jews were dirt poor. Lithuania would be an example. There's anti-Semitism in countries where Jews were very wealthy. Psychology. Hannah Arendt, maybe it was a psychological aberration, but it's a little strange to say that pagans, atheists, saints, communists, capitalists, ancients, moderns, men, women, rich, poor, Christians, Muslims all have the same psychological sickness. That really doesn't explain things. That's just putting a label on it. Some say it's because we claim to be the chosen people. So that's interesting, because who doesn't claim to be the chosen people? I mean, you ever listen to talk radio in the United States? I mean, half the radio shows start by saying the greatest nation on earth is the United States. That annoys me because I'm Australian. The greatest democracy on earth. Well, I don't know, is it? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, India is the largest English-speaking democracy in the world. There are plenty of other democratic countries that have freedom, the same as America. I don't know. Is this the greatest? But Americans believe so. Japan. There is a term in Japanese, gaijin. What is a gaijin? Basically a barbarian, a foreigner, us. Right? And it's very hard to get acceptance into Japanese society. There's a sumo wrestler. I think he's from either Fiji or Samoa, perhaps. He's one of the top sumo wrestlers in Japan, and he speaks fluent Japanese. And he's a top in a really exclusively Japanese type of club. And he's still considered by many. They call him a gaijin. So they believe they're the greatest. And plenty of countries, plenty of ethnicities, many religions believe they're the chosen people. So it doesn't make sense that only the Jews, right? Everyone thinks they're the chosen people, and we're the only one to get flack for it. Some say it's land disputes. That's ridiculous because anti-Semitism predates any type of land disputes with the Arabs, etc. So what is the correct explanation? And what is an explanation that, and it's interesting, there is a language, an expression used by one of the medieval Jewish scholars of Spain, the Ritva. The expression he uses, which is, how's your Hebrew, folks? Nes l'ra'ah. What does that mean? Nes l'ra'ah. That means a miracle that is evil. A miracle of the bad. What does that mean? You see, a miracle, nes, in Hebrew, miracle is related to the word nes, which means banner or flag. Okay, and the reason for that is that what does a miracle do? A miracle is something which rises above the mundane to indicate the hand of God involved here, to indicate something. So most miracles are good. The Exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the miracle of Hanukkah, great. But not all miracles do we end up smiling. But we do end up seeing the hand of God. And so the Ritva says that sometimes there can be something called a nes l'ro'ah, meaning a miracle that exposes something almost supernatural. The hatred, the evil of anti-Semitism is to a certain degree, I think, almost a nes l'ra'ah. You know what I'm saying? It's almost supernatural and indicates something. It's a very strange idea. And I think there are a couple of sources for it, but one I think is the following. It's I think primarily ideological. It's not economic, psychological, it's ideological. How is it ideological? Think about it. What earthly common factor is there amongst extreme Muslims on the one hand, Southern Baptists on the other hand, extreme left-wing socialists or communists, atheists, right-wing? What's in common? What binds them? Why do they all hate Israel and they hate Jews? Right? So what's in common? What does Judaism have? It's very interesting, very, very strange. And I think the answer lies in the following. You know, there were some Christian saints, doctors of the Catholic Church, who made a certain prediction. St. John Chrysostom, Sermon 6, number 3. He says that the fact that the Caesars were able to destroy the temple showed God's absolute rejection of the Jews. He says God, by destroying the temple, that shows God rejected the Jews. And there's what they call replacement theology. You know what replacement theology is? That the Jews were replaced by the Christians. The 12 tribes are replaced by the 12 apostles. The Torah is replaced by the New Testament. The church replaces the synagogue. Replacement theology. As a student of mine once said, so like we're frozen, they're chosen. I said, that is exactly correct. We're frozen, they're chosen. So, and that manifests itself in a number of ways. Augustine writes that the Jews are like the librarians, the servants of the librarian. They are the custodians, like the slave who carries the master's books to court, but has to wait outside. Augustine and Chrysostom believed that the Jews were exiled, the temple was destroyed because the Jews were rejected by God and replaced by Christianity. Thomas Aquinas, he says that because the Jews crucified Jesus, they are destined to perpetual servitude, so that the sovereigns of states may treat Jewish goods as their own property. Now, there's a similar sentiment expressed in the Quran. In Surah 9, which is Surah is a chapter. Surah 9 is a chapter that deals heavily with the Jews. But it talks about the idea that the Jews, because they rejected Muhammad, they rejected Rasul Allah, the messenger of God, so therefore they have been rejected by God. And therefore, wherever they must be reduced low, ignominy shall be upon them, unless they grasp a rope from Allah and a rope from men. Meaning the Jews have to show their allegiance and subservience to Islam because they were rejected. So we find, both in Christianity and in Islam, a similar theme. What's the theme? That the Jews have been rejected by God in favour of Christianity, in favour of Islam. Now, here's the problem. The problem is this. What if the Jews seem to be still God's people? If the Jews are still existing after thousands of years, we're still speaking Hebrew, we are coming back to the land of Israel, we still believe in monotheism. So what does that mean for the Christian and for the Muslim? That's a problem. It's a theological contradiction. Because if they are the new chosen, so what are 6 million Jews in Israel? The revival of Hebrew from a language of prayer to now language, it's unbelievable. And we can still speak ancient Hebrew. One of my sons, Pinchas, lives in Israel, is a lawyer there, and he served in the Israeli army, he studied in yeshiva in Israel. Remember when he was a little kid, we went to the Israel Museum, he climbed up onto the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit and starts reading from the scroll of Isaiah, Chazon Yeshua ben Amoz, and he says, Abba, come over here. I come over, and he says, we were doing this in school 2 weeks ago. I said, it's a miracle. He remembers what he was doing in school 2 weeks ago. But what was even more miraculous is the fact that here's a child of the 20th century who is reading something written 2,200 years ago based on something which was prophesied 2,600 years ago, and he could read it fluently, and he speaks the language. He's got friends called Yeshaya. He's actually got a son called Yishai. But that's pretty unbelievable. That's amazing. So our existence is a bit of a contradiction. Let me quote to you from, you see, in 1948, the Vatican had a bit of a problem. Because if Augustine and Chrysostom are correct, then the Jews can only come back to Israel when we've rejected Jesus. But in 1948, when we re-established the State of Israel, when the State of Israel declared independence, did we accept Jesus? No. So the Vatican had a problem. They changed in Moralis, Volume 5, the Vatican says, yes, but it's not a contradiction because the Jews don't have Jerusalem. So theologically, it's not a contradiction to our predictions. Then what happened in 1967? The paratroopers, who are not theologians, although I have a son who's in the paratroops now, who's a bit of a theologian, but the paratroops who conquered the old city, guess what? They created a huge theological problem for the church. Because the Jews are not only back in Israel, the Jews are back in Jerusalem. And let me quote you from Rabbi Benjamin Blech, colleague of mine at Yeshiva University. What is so very special about the prediction of the church involving the Jew is the doctrine of faith made something clear. The return of the Jews to Israel from their decreed lands of dispersion will never take place unless Jews embrace Jesus. If a religion stakes a claim on credibility by affirming that an event cannot ever happen, and it does, it would appear that the damage is irreparable. There's only one way for Rome to deal with the unacceptable reality. Jerusalem would not be recognised as the capital city, nor would the Jews be accepted as its master. Obviously not. Unspoken aloud is a powerful truth, confirmed to me by a leading political figure in Israel. So sensitive is the subject, he has not only forbidden me to quote him, warned me if I ever would he'd deny having said it. Behind the scenes he advised me, there is more pressure for internationalisation of Jerusalem coming from the Christian world than from the Arab world. It is not hard to understand. A Jewish Jerusalem does not deprive them of territory, it takes from them the validity of a testament. I would say that he is right, but I think there's something more to it. I think with Muslims it also is a theological problem. Because if, according to the Quran in Surah 9 and other surahs, if the Jews are to remain downtrodden and ignominy upon them, and only can be considered appropriate if they stretch out their hand in subservience, pay jizya, that was a tax that Jews and Christians would have to pay to the Muslims. So then, let me ask you something. If the whole state of Israel was a few square miles of Tel Aviv, but it was independent with its own flag and national anthem and government, would that be a contradiction to the concept of the Jew being subservient? Yes, it would. It doesn't matter how big the territory is. It could be just Tel Aviv. It could be a little farm somewhere. If that farm or if that city has Jews who are independent, with their own flag, with their own state, with their own government, they're not paying tribute to the Muslims, that is a contradiction to the Quran. Do you understand? Is I'm following here? Okay. But this also, the Jews' existence, also a problem, not just for Christians and Muslims. It's a problem for, and by the way, Kufi, at the Kufi conference, they deliberately spoke about this, and they said, we are not believers in the replacement theology. That's why they can support Israel. They believe replacement theology is heresy, which is very interesting. So, what's also interesting is, why is an atheist, far left, extreme left, why are they opposed to Israel? There are probably a combination of reasons, but partially is because of this idea as well. Because you see, from the perspective of someone who doesn't believe in the narrative of the Bible, who doesn't believe that there's a God who is involved in the world, who has given promises to the Jewish people, who has made a covenant with the Jewish people thousands of years ago and will keep that covenant, then the Jewish people are a little bit, might make you a little nervous. What are we still doing here? We are basically like fossils who have come to life. There was actually a historian who called us fossils. In 1945, he said the Jews are basically fossils and fossils don't come back to life. Well, 3 years later, his name was Arnold Toynbee. He had egg on his face 3 years later because the fossil came back to life. If you're walking along and you see dinosaur footprints in stone, I've seen them near Jerusalem. There's a beautiful area called Jerusalem Forest, and there's a large stone there where there's fossilized footsteps of like a small herd, a family of dinosaurs. There's no need to be nervous, because if they're fossilized, that means those dinosaurs have been dead for 20 million years. You don't have to be nervous about it. If, however, you're on the beach in Tel Aviv, and in the fresh, wet sand, you see a three-toed, velociraptor footprint, you have reason to be nervous. So this, by the way, is what makes atheists nervous. Because we, the Jews, should be fossils. We are fossils. We're old enough to be fossilized. We're 3,200 years old, for heaven's sakes. The language should be out there. We should be in a museum. You should go to a museum in Prague, which is what actually Hitler wanted, and should be able to see the now extinct Jewish race. We should be in there in the Met with the Etruscan display. We are, but we're still around. And that's unbelievable. And that's disturbing. That is disturbing if your worldview is based on the concept that there's no God, there's no covenant, there's no divine providence, there's nothing special about the Jewish people, then our existence, our success, our impact, the state of Israel, the success of that is deeply disturbing. It's deeply disturbing to someone who believes in those traditional Christian prophecies, because we have Israel and we didn't reject Jesus. It's disturbing to someone who believes in the Quran, which says that the Jews will be cursed with ignominy until they grasp a rope from Allah and a rope from man, meaning until they show their subservience to the Muslims. It's disturbing to them, and it's disturbing to someone who says the Jews are nothing special, and there's no God, and there's no covenant. So that's why I think that it's appropriate to use the Ritvaz terminology for anti-Semitism, nes l'ra'ah. It is a miracle. It's a miracle, but it's a bad miracle. But it's a miracle nonetheless, in the sense, what does a miracle do? It shows me the hand of God in the world. It shows me that the Jewish people are alive and kicking. The Jewish people are thriving. The Jewish people are here. And that is something absolutely incredible. When I go to Israel, and there's no, but it's that same thing, that same feeling that drives certain people crazy should give us inspiration. When I drive on the turnpike past exit 13, 14, and I see Newark Airport, and I occasionally see the tail of an El Al plane with the blue stripes and the Magen David, I've got to admit to you, every single time I see that, I feel something. It's like, wow, it's great. Just to see that, isn't that? But do you realise the miracle of seeing such a thing? If you would have told a Jew 300 years ago, in the ghetto in Venice, such a thing would exist, they'd think you're crazy. Not necessarily, because they might be a believing Jew, and they may say, yes, God willing. If you would have told a Jew in Morocco 500 years ago, such a thing would be, I don't know. So when we see these things, we should get as much inspiration, at least, as the anti-Semite draws hatred and annoyance. For us, it's unbelievable. We see this, and we see a miracle in front of our own eyes. Okay. I have 4 children, thank God, who live in Israel, 3 married with grandchildren there. I have 3 sons who serve in the Israeli army. I serve in the Israeli army. And to me, I look at these, and I say, I'm thinking any of my ancestors in Galicia, in Poland, and probably further back maybe in Barcelona in Spain, and then maybe further back in Gaul, and maybe further back then in Israel, all the way back, and what they went through. And now you tell them, I predict, one of my ancestors 200 years ago would have gone to Madame Zelda for a fortune telling. There are cookies over here. Are there fortune cookies? Should be, right? You would have gone, right? You open the fortune cookie, and it says you will have a descendant who will have studied in a yeshiva in Israel with 3,000 students in Jerusalem, speaking Hebrew. Will then have gone to a university in Tel Aviv. That's a new city. You've never heard of that. It's a Jewish city. Right? And will have gone to university studying law in the Hebrew language. And will have been a sharpshooter in the Givati regiment battalion of a Jewish army in Israel. And will be someone who, and you'll say, oh, and it's all the same person? You'd want your money back from Madame Zelda. But actually that has happened, that has come true. But that same thing that gives us hope and that gives us knowledge that God is with us and we have a covenant and that covenant will not be forgotten, that's what drives anti-Semites crazy. So it's a nace which has caused bad, but it's also causing good. And it's the type of thing that we see it, when we see anti-Semitism, what we're actually seeing is something, I think, which is they're admitting to that fear that they feel deep down that could be, deep down on some level, could be that we are right. I think we are, right? But for a lot of people, if the Jews are right, that means they're wrong. And if they're right, it means the Jews are wrong. So our existence, our success in Torah in the state of Israel, in the preservation of Judaism, preservation of the Hebrew language, in the reading of the same Torah we've been reading for thousands of years, and so on and so forth, celebrating Hanukkah and lighting the candles, and all of that, that is absolutely incredible. That's a nace, not l'ra. That's a miracle, l'tova, a miracle which is good, and hopefully we will see the final fulfillment of all of those covenants very speedily in our days. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening, and God bless. I'll be happy to take questions, heckling, alternate speeches, insults, political statements, endorsements. My book is for sale outside, by the way, so it's very deep, so you probably should buy 2 copies and read it twice. So, yes, any questions? Yeah.
Are there any countries you think are particularly receptive, like the Jewish people, and what do you attribute that to?
Are there any?
Like countries that are like more, like I know there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but which countries are like more like very welcoming to the Jewish people, and what do you attribute that to? Like it seems like a lot of times like they make Antisemitism.
Yes, that is an interesting question.
Things like that.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting is that, first of all, in South America, Costa Rica, very pro-Israel, very welcoming to the Jews. Panama, very welcoming to the Jews, very pro-Israel. In Europe, Albania was a very country that was very welcoming to the Jews and really helped the Jews during the Second World War, etc. Denmark helped the Jews tremendously. The majority of the Jewish population of Denmark was actually saved during the Second World War by the Danes, which is type of interesting. So there are countries which are well. I think hard to know what's in common amongst all those countries. One of the things that seems to be in common is they're not heavily ideological or very, very religious. Maybe that's got something to do with it, because a lot of what I said is to do with ideology. Also, I should point out, there are countries where there's no anti-Semitism and never has been, probably India. No, I was just led a tour of India in the summer, and Legacy Kosher Tours, I was scholar in residence, and there's no anti-Semitism whatsoever in India. The only anti-Semitism ever in India was when the Portuguese came to Goa and imported the Inquisition. So it was a European import to India. But Jews in India were accepted completely. China, that's probably because China and Japan, China is just a tiny proportion, I mean, it's a tiny percentage of the population, but in China, we had 2 tours of China, and the reputation of Jews in China, if you ask, a lot of Chinese never heard of the Jews. Jews in China is Yutai Ren. Yutai is like a transliteration of Yehudi. Yutai Ren means nation. Yutai Ren, the Jewish nation. But if you ask educated Chinese in the universities, etc., the impression is that Jews are all smart and good at business, which is interesting. There are a number at some couple of large universities in China. There are Jewish studies faculties. In fact, we had a lecturer of Jewish studies from China, spoke at Yeshiva University last year to the graduate school, and we actually have a student at Yeshiva University who is not Jewish, but he's from China, and he is doing his doctorate in Jewish studies. And there's no anti-Semitism there. It's interesting because someone asked me, we had a Chinese tour guide, and someone asked me, did he want to try Jewish food? You know, Jews always like Chinese food. Was he interested in Jewish food? I said, look, we had pastrami sandwiches he tried when he liked it. They said, did you offer him cholent on Shabbos? I said, listen, there has never been any anti-Semitism in China. There's no reason that I should start it. We brought a lot of places in China, there's already kosher food available, like from Chabad and restaurants, etc. We're in Xi'an, which is one of the centres of Chinese cuisine. It was literally one of the centres of Chinese cuisine in China. We were staying at one of the best hotels with one of the top chefs. We'd brought food, frozen food, ahead of time from Chicago, kosher food, which was in the freezer in the hotel. When it was warmed up, double wrapped and everything, and the maitre d' is taking it out, and my friend Yaakov Lerfeld is with him taking it out, and the maitre d' opens it up and he sees that it's Chinese food. And he looks at my friend and he says, wait, you brought frozen Chinese food from Chicago To Xi'an, China? Like he thought we were a little crazy. But, to be kosher, yeah. So I haven't seen any studies of what's in common amongst those countries, but yeah. Australia, for example, very welcoming to the Jews, very little anti-Semitism. Most of the anti-Semitism now, we have a lot of security at synagogues and schools in Australia, but that's primarily because of an influx of Middle Eastern Muslims. So most of the anti-Semitism attacks in Australia have come from Lebanese, Palestinians, etc., who are in Australia. But the average Australian is pretty chill. Doesn't, Oh, you're Jewish? That's great, man. No worries.
Beside all of the anti-Semitism that you discussed with the history, I guess I'm more concerned now in America, like Farrakhan and the black groups that he's affiliated with are saying that the Jews did the slave trade, and they're spreading a lot of more lies, and I'm just worried because we have all the Arabs that are, some Arabs are very anti-Semitic, and now the blacks who used to be close with Jews are becoming very anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that's not a phenomenon that I've looked into. I do have a feeling. I just finished. I'm doing a doctorate, so I was just at Fordham University, which is a Catholic university, in the Theology department. I just finished a course on Islam there, which type of I feel like I'm part of a joke. A rabbi walks into a Jesuit university for a course on Islam. So I'm not sure what the punchline is, but we actually studied the writings. We were studying the writings of some of the very famous American Muslims, like Malcolm X, for example. Farrakhan would be an example, etc. And my impression was, again, we just had a few classes on this. I'm not an expert on it. My impression was that it's a fairly limited impact that Farrakhan has. Although he makes a lot of noise in the news, but in terms of the average Muslim in the United States or the average black, they don't really have that much to do with Farrakhan. I think a lot of people recognise him as a slightly loopy, to put it nicely, a little crazy, right? But I don't know how much impact he really has. Although, unfortunately, there are people like Linda Sarsour, the Women's March, and there are people who are in positions of a little bit of power and also this is a disturbing phenomenon is that a lot of anti-Semitism, if it comes from people of colour, is given a pass, because since they are people of colour and the Jews are identified as people of privilege, white, wealthy, etc., so therefore the anti-Semitism coming from people of colour is given a pass, that's disturbing, and it should not be given a pass. I pointed out to the class, there was a woman in the class who pointed out that you just have to look at the colour and you know what's going on in the Middle East. I said, well, that's very interesting, because about 50% of the population of Israel are about as dark as most Arabs, and have been in the Middle East for approximately 3,000 years, and are Arabic speakers by native Arabic speakers, and their complexion is certainly not European. So what do you mean, the colour? Right, she has no idea. I said, my son has friends in his unit who are darker than an average black person in the United States. And they're Jewish. They're Ethiopian Jews. Right? And the Jews of Morocco and Libya and Syria and Iraq and Iran and so on and so forth. It's just but the problem is that people are ignorant. Most people are ignorant. I mean, most Jews have no idea about what the Jewish population looks like or is, etc. And something that we have to do is try to show people that the Jewish people is not monochromatic, but actually is a range of races and ethnicities, brown, black, dark, etc., and white. That Israel is central to Judaism. So if you are anti-Israel, you're actually anti-Jewish. Because Israel and the land of Israel is central to Judaism, always has been, always will. And those are important points to put across. But again, I don't know the degree. It's not something I'm an expert in. I don't know the degree of danger that Farrakhan or his ilk poses. But I think Malcolm X, towards the end of his life, seemed to have, I think, recanted quite a bit of his anti-Semitism. Became a little more chilled. But I don't know about Farrakhan. Maybe he'll do tshuva. I don't know. Don't expect a phone call from him before next Yom Kippur, but nevertheless, yeah. We'll take one more question. No? Good, and then I have a KKK rally to attend. No, sorry. That was a joke. That's not recorded, is it? Okay, fine. All right, thank you.
Let us know when you come. Is there?